James, last week the High Court made a landmark ruling about indefinite detention. It's had enormous political fallout this week, but before we get into that, can you tell me about the High Court decision and the case that initiated all of this?
Sure. So this case was brought by a Rohingya man known as NZYQ. We don't actually know his name. Essentially, his lawyers argued that it was unconstitutional for a person to be held in immigration detention indefinitely. The case has been on foot for quite a while. Ultimately, the High Court found that they agreed with that argument put by his lawyers, and that essentially he would have to be immediately released, which happened. That then had a flow-on effect. There are, I think, 92 other people essentially in his situation being held indefinitely in immigration detention, although the court said there is the possibility of up to 340 people flagged in the documents. We haven't seen the court's judgment yet, but effectively the ruling in favour of the Rohingya man meant that another 92 had to be immediately released. At this point in time, it's not clear, but it's either 83 or 84 who have already been released.
And James, what do we know about the more than 80 people who've been released already?
Not a whole lot. We know that, from the Immigration Minister, Andrew Giles, 3 of them have been convicted of murder. Several of them have committed sex offences. We know that one of them is a Malaysian man who allegedly, on the orders of former Malaysian PM Najib Razak, associate of his, committed a murder which saw a pregnant Mongolian model murdered and then blown up to essentially by C4 to hide her body about 8 or 9 years ago. Beyond that, we've got a few details about a couple of other cases or a couple of the other people, but essentially that's about it, Rach.
This issue sparked some pretty fierce debate in Parliament, David. Opposition leader Peter Dutton sought leave to move a motion on Wednesday condemning the government over the rise in anti-Semitism and raised concerns about the individuals who've been released from immigration detention. How did that go down, and how does anti-Semitism factor into this particular debate?
Well, the way I see it is it was like pouring petrol over a pretty incendiary moment in Parliament, putting anti-Semitism into the debate when the primary contest in Parliament is about the immediate issue of what to do about the High Court decision on detention. Suddenly, the debate in question time was just ranging over a whole lot of areas. At one point, Peter Dutton was talking about budget management, anti-Semitism, and detention and asylum seekers, all in the one debate. But I think it's important to have a look at the wording of the motion that he actually put. He tried to suspend question time and the usual business of the Parliament to move a motion that condemned Anthony Albanese for failing to stamp out anti-Semitism, among other failings. So it was a personal attack on Anthony Albanese, and I think when you accuse somebody of not stopping anti-Semitism, it's going to be a pretty emotional debate, and that's what we saw. So by intent, the coalition wanted an incredibly personal debate in Parliament, and that's what they got. It was quite, aggressive tactics from Peter Dutton and a very angry response from Anthony Albanese. I think it reflected poorly on the coalition in terms of the tactics, but also in terms of the judgment. We're all meant to be trying to lower the temperature on the situation in the Middle East in Australia. We've got Jewish people who are scared about their personal safety because of the way in which some of these protests have happened. We've seen anger on the streets. We've seen calls from the Director General of Security, Mike Burgess, to say moderate your language. And what we saw from the coalition was the opposite, quite inflammatory tactics.
But there has been concern over the High Court decision, both about the fact that these people have been released, but also the government's plan to legislate around the High Court ruling. David, can you tell me about these concerns and what you make of them?
I think on the issue of the detention, the coalition has actually been on really strong ground. In his press conference, Peter Dutton made a series of very telling points about the government's slow action on this front. Adding anti-Semitism to the debate in question time only undermined his attack, I thought. So look at it this way. The decision came down on Wednesday of last week. It took until Saturday for the government to put out a press release. acknowledging the decision and saying they would do something. There was no clarity in that statement about what they would do. They then went into Parliament on Monday with everybody back and with no clarity on Monday about what they would do. Only on Tuesday did the coalition really try to put pressure on the government with question after question in question time towards Immigration Minister Andrew Giles about what was the answer. Now, we have a situation where there are 3 murderers who have been released, an unknown number of sex offenders. These are serious questions. What is the government going to do to respond to a High Court decision? And as James mentioned, there are potentially others who may have to be released. So the government's been slow. It hasn't communicated well. I think at times it felt like the issue would blow over without it having to step up and say, actually, this has happened and we're going to do the following 5 things. Only now, later in the week, is there clarity about the response. And so the coalition has rightly put pressure on the government to show what it's going to do.
Well, on Wednesday, the Immigration Minister did introduce legislation to amend the Migration Act to place tough restrictions on those released from indefinite migration detention. James, what conditions will this law impose on those former detainees?
So some of the conditions, Rachel, that will potentially be imposed on these 83 plus people include possibly ankle bracelets to allow for monitoring, curfews, and the prospect of jail sentences when people breach their visa conditions, if they breach their visa conditions. So this is not something that would apply to everyone. It would apply to certain individuals in certain circumstances where they're considered to be a risk to the community. Now, I guess to pick up on something that David said earlier, a point a coalition MP made to me yesterday is that this case, these sorts of situations, they described it as essentially as a minister killer. Like it's about as serious as it gets for an immigration minister. This case, they were flabbergasted that Labor had not prepared draft legislation, given that this case has been on foot for a couple of years, that they didn't have draft legislation ready to go to respond to the High Court ruling. And indeed, again, to pick up David's point, the government has looked flat-footed on this. They have been caught napping and they are now scrambling. I think that's a criticism that Dutton has made that has been correct.
This legislation has come before the High Court released its full decision. What are the potential ramifications of bringing it into law before the government's had a look at that?
The government acknowledges that it has to do something as fast as possible because it's under pressure from the coalition. But there's a chance that it may have to come back to Parliament in the future and pass further legislation in the light of the full reasons for the High Court ruling. So those full reasons are yet to emerge and have to be digested by the government. There's an argument between Labor and the coalition about the strength of the immediate measures. The coalition, has been standing up saying they want mandatory electronic monitoring and things like that. These are immediate issues that both sides need to overcome in order to get rapid action. But I think that there will be an ongoing argument about what's happened here because some of the questions that James raised highlight things that will come up in Senate estimates in the future, things that will be subject to freedom of information requests. What was the advice to the government about this case? When did they make decisions? There is a question about whether any of these people were released without visas. That's a claim that's out there. We don't know the facts. There's a lot we still don't know. We don't know the names of these people. We know that there are 3 murderers. We know of one case. We don't know of the other 2 cases. So there's still a lot to emerge about this that will cause a lot of political pressure for the government over time.
Talking to coalition MPs, they believe this draft legislation doesn't go far enough, that it's very much a bare bones piece of legislation. Now, I think that's probably a deliberate tactical decision from the government to pick up David's point. We might be back here needing to alter the legislation in the future once we see the High Court's full judgment. Again, to pick up what David said, the coalition wants to go a lot further with this, a lot tougher with some of the measures that would be in place on all of these people being released. The government is arguing that's not reasonable, given that it's not within the powers of a minister to essentially act as a judge and say, right, all of these people must wear an ankle bracelet, for example, when they haven't. I mean, it's not the role of a minister to say, you are, effectively convicted of this crime and we're going to impose this punishment on you. That's for the courts to do. So Dutton and the coalition will attempt to amend this legislation. I don't think that will succeed.
David, this debate is playing out in the midst of a much bigger conversation about Australia's population and migration levels. Before we get into the concerns about this, I want to understand the numbers, just how high immigration levels are now compared to previous years, and where are we seeing a marked increase?
The big increase has been in student numbers, and there are logical reasons for it. The pandemic conditions eased, the borders opened, students returned. That was a great thing for universities. They wanted the overseas students back and some of the temporary workers back in industry, but that's been kind of back with a vengeance, because I've talked to people who think that net overseas migration is getting to a level, at an annual level, of the high 400,000s. 490,000 was a number put to me yesterday. This is a forecast about where the official numbers may end up. Now, bear in mind that we've had numbers in the 200,000, 250,000, 230,000 for net overseas migration over many years. So it's at least twice what Australians have been accustomed to over time. And it's also far ahead of the forecasts that the government set as recently as May this year. Last year, they were talking about 235,000. Then in the May budget, they were talking about 400,000. They've gone beyond that. So I think the onus is on the government to show that they've got a plan here in terms of dealing with this intake. And, where we are seeing actual results from voters who are expressing lower confidence in the migration program as a result of what they can see around them in their communities.
James, let's get into some of those concerns about this now. Earlier this week, outgoing Future Fund Chair Peter Costello, who also chairs Nine, said that the level of immigration in Australia needs to be carefully managed. He warned if it's not, it could put pressure on inflation, which was a concern echoed by one of the nation's top economists. Why would high levels of immigration lead to higher inflation?
Pretty simple, Rach. You could probably explain it better than me, but essentially more people in this country creates greater demand for goods, services, housing, those sorts of things. When you've got more people in the market competing for goods, it pushes the price of something up. And particularly in housing, I think we're seeing a pretty clear evidence that that's exactly what's happening. Immigration is contributing to that upwards pressure on rents and on house prices. The other thing I think to say here is the coalition has very clearly identified this as an issue that they're going to run with all the way to the election. We're hearing more and more from Peter Dutton and some of his ministers that the government has let immigration get out of control, and I think we're going to hear that more and more. This is going to be one of the central planks of the coalition's pitch to voters over the next 18 months. And I think it very much reminds me of the lead up to the 2010 election, when particularly in those last 3 or 4 months before that poll, the last days of Rudd, the first days of Julia Gillard, there was a big debate over whether we want a big Australia policy or, I guess a medium Australia or a small Australia. And Tony Abbott picked it up and ran with this issue, and I think that's exactly what Peter Dutton's going to do too.
There is a bit of debate about how much migration adds to inflation. An economist I've spoken to this week said, well, sure, when they first move to Australia, they buy housing goods, they need a place to live. But as they live here for a longer time, they get jobs and they contribute to the economy. So they take that pressure on inflation off. How difficult is that for the government to manage in terms of the fight against the coalition in the lead up to the next election?
I think it's incredibly difficult. I mean, everything you've just said is correct. Migrants come to this country, they work, they contribute, they build lives. There's a further economic point to make too, Rachel, which is that we don't have enough workers to complete all the infrastructure projects in the pipeline. We're seeing Catherine King, the infrastructure minister, scaling back some of these projects, saying there's so much price pressure because we can't get these workers. We need to push pause on some of these things. That applies to housing as well. That applies to jobs in bakeries. We need migrants to continue to grow as a country because our birth rate, like most Western countries, is not particularly high. So you've got to bring migrants in, but you've got to balance it with community expectations. You've got to take people with you, essentially.
Speaking of that, David, regardless of whether immigration is actually making some of these problems worse, a new survey on social cohesion in Australia has shown that community sentiment towards migration in our country has taken a big hit. Can you tell me about that?
The new report's called Mapping Social Cohesion, and it's a very thorough study done every year. It's done by the Australian National University with a non-profit called the Scanlon Institute. Now, it's been done since 2007, and I've written about it in many years, and I think it's quite a good guide to the mood in the community. 33% of people think that the migrant intake is too high. The concern is back and growing. That concern was only 24% 1 year ago. Clearly, with the borders closed, it eased as an issue for many Australians. Things are changing. At the same time, talking to James O'Donnell at the ANU about the depths of the findings here, the people who are opposing migration are not doing so because they're worried about multiculturalism or the kinds of people we're bringing in. They find that it's about the number. It's not about the racial background of the migrants. It's really about the national mood being much more stressed. People are stressed financially. Obviously, there are global factors that add to that stress as well. But this survey was taken before war in the Middle East between Hamas and Israel. But it does show that with people under financial stress, confidence in the migration program also eases.
David, James, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks, Rachel.